So, welcome to today's episode of Free Thought Hour. We're doing things a little bit differently. We are doing a pre-recorded show with, and now I can confirm, nominated in the category for Content Creation Podcast at the DSTV Creators Awards. I don't even know about them, so I'm completely clueless. We have with us today Des Latham. I will begin by saying we're doing this pre-recorded, so this is not live. We're doing a recording because Des is busy on weekends and he can't be our guest, but I was insistent that we had to learn more about Des Latham. Des Latham is a South African podcaster. I came upon him with his podcast about South African history. So John will hopefully join us in a moment. He is busy with other things because it's not Saturday evening. It is actually Wednesday afternoon, and we have Des Latham as our guest. Des,
Tisha,
tell us about your recent venture onto the purple carpet at the DSTV Creators Awards. Please begin there. Let's begin where we are and move back to where your podcast.
Tisha, I thought you were going to tell people we were pre-recording because I swear like a trooper and you have to edit me later. But that's not the reason.
No.
So there I was on the purple carpet with all these people in the Instagram phones and the TikTok devices and YouTube special devices, filming themselves on selfie sticks. And I was standing there and they're in their early 20s and I'm 62. And I was thinking, this is the thorn amongst the roses, no question about that. Here's all the beautiful people of South Africa, literally beautiful people. And then this wrinkled old crone / haggard old man in the corner with his kind of ruffled hair and strange outfit, staring at folks. So that was my introduction, I suppose, to the idea of making it in content creation. And I've worked as a journalist and for every kind of thing you can imagine. I did mobile phone content. I was a radio journalist. I was a television editor, online editor for Business Day and Financial Mail, a long list of things. I was the chief director at Government Communication Information System. I was contracted for a year there as chief director, which means editor-in-chief, all these long-winded things. But I've always had this idea that information is at the moment is kind of doomed us in some ways to experience flow of consciousness that is really poisonous, and the effect it's having on everyone around us is really dangerous, I think, in the long term. So in 2017, I was looking for a podcast on the Boer War. There wasn't one. So I thought, well, let me do one because I have an African history honors degree. I've always been fascinated by history. And with the broadcasting background, why don't I give it a shot? Because if I don't, someone else will at some point. And it just went into orbit. The response was off the charts. And I was actually quite shocked. It still gets thousands of listens a week. I finished it in 3 years. In 2020, it was done. 4 years later, I get emails virtually every day from listeners. And it just popped up again on the World Podcast Links as top 50 podcasts. Now, I don't necessarily believe all these logs, but how can you explain these things? So I realized that having a capacity to tell a story based on voice is so important. That's it in a nutshell. All our lives, I recall growing up with my grandmother, who was a real character, telling us stories as I went to sleep. And when I mean character, I mean she was a real character. She grew up in the 20s. So her stories made your hair stand on end.
Where was this? Where did she live? Where did you grow up, Des?
Well, she was born in Beaufort West. And then she lived in Zimbabwe for a while. Which is where I was born. In 2 years, when I was 2 years old, I left Zimbabwe for South Africa and grew up in the Zulu culture, speaking Zulu before English mainly. Very strong culture affinity, and that also helped me during the apartheid period. Because I was a contradiction. I would think of things and I'd even dream in Zulu, and yet we had the system of abuse of apartheid, which was itself another disaster for South Africa, of course.
Yes, sorry, I have to. There we have. Welcome, John,
hello, John.
to your own show. Yeah.
Hi, Des. I'm sorry to be late. It's a long story. I'll try and explain to you after we've done the recording, if you
John,
want to know.
I
I was
understand.
I interrupted Des. He was telling us about his uh, award nominated podcast. So I didn't know this when I
Ooh.
invited Des. So
Forgive me,
but now,
it's not false modesty, it was shock. I was trying to explain to Tertia that everyone there were called content creators. They were literally a third of my age, not even half my age.
Well, I
So I
know.
was
Yes, I meet that too because I am also very ancient. And when I tell people I'm a YouTuber, they drop dead.
but so now John Des is telling me about his grandmother, who was born in Beaufort West, went to Zimbabwe. Whereabouts in KZN? Or in Zulu? Des could speak Zulu fluently before he could speak Afrikaans.
Ooh.
Where was this? Where did you grow up that you
I grew up
learned?
in a place. Well, that's the other thing. I grew up in a place called Nkweleni, which is Umhlatuzi Valley. Umhlatuzi Valley
Oh,
is where
sorry,
Shaka.
Des. I just have to say this is amazing. This is so funny because I grew up in Vryheid.
Oh, well, I know.
I was born in Durban. I know exactly where Nkweleni is. So for the listeners and the viewers, if Nkweleni is if you go from Durban inland, you go north, then there's an escarpment. You go up a mountain, but in the valley you have orange trees. It's very hot, very humid, and I always thought when we went from Vryheid to our coastal holidays in Durban, when we went down the Nkweleni Valley, I
Yes.
started getting uncomfortable because that's where then
Nkweleni is
it's the
infamous.
sugar.
Speed is
Yes.
50 degrees Celsius plus. In summer, we had 1 year of 49, 50 degrees, which killed actually people and trees. And
Yeah.
on top of that, with that temperature, thinking that was normal. So to this day, I cannot take cold. And also, it's a really interesting environment because Ishawi to the south is about 1,300 feet. Melmoth to the north is about 1,400 feet. And Nkweleni is at 300 feet. And it's 60 kilometers inland. So the air condenses from the mountains into this, and the humidity is off the charts. It's
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
100% flat.
Yeah.
So,
So
that was my
so
introduction
this
to life, was growing up in that
it's just
environment.
Very
I
sweaty.
find it
Yes.
funny that I didn't know any of these things about Des before we started talking now, but there's definitely an affinity with people who grow up in the same area because I can absolutely identify with what you experience, and to be able to speak Zulu fluently in that region of the world is a major plus because most of the Zulu speaking people in that part of South Africa, they don't speak English, they don't speak
Exactly.
Afrikaans, and they
No.
don't speak English. So it's like living in a foreign country if you cannot speak the native language.
Yeah.
Okay, Des, now that
Can
I
I-
have a very good picture. Sorry, go on, John.
Can I just introduce my only Zulu word?
I want to hear
Which
what that
is-
is.
Hope it's clean.
It's unkulunkulu.
Unkulunkulu.
Nkulunkulu.
Unkulunkulu. God,
Well,
the great one. Well, the great one.
yes, yes.
The bigger than bigger.
Yeah,
Yeah,
So
Unkulunkulu.
I use that in conversation when people tell me that that God is real or something, and I question which God by saying unkulunkulu, but obviously my stresses are on the wrong syllables.
Yes, Zulu, like many bunch of languages, stresses the
So
second
you
to
can
last
get a
syllable.
lesson now,
Ah.
Des.
Just out of interest.
Yeah.
That's why it has a melodic and aspect to it.
Okay, so
Like
Des, you can
Afrikaans.
teach John how to pronounce it, and then he can say it perfectly well. Okay, so you could speak Zulu before you could speak Afrikaans or English, I presume, because you said you were 2 years old and when you moved into
I was
that area.
speaking Zulu
Take
a
the
lot
story
more
from
than
there.
English. Okay, so growing up in apartheid South Africa and having the capacity to, think in another language and to act in another language. Also, I grew up in part Ngweleni, which is adjacent to where the Zulu traditional leaders come from, like the middle of the Zulu people. The Kwabi people, for example, are the original speakers of what's now known as Zulu. From the valley I grew up in. they predate the Zulu there, for example. And I used to go swimming in Inkweleni River, and that's where Nandi, Shaka's mother, swam. So it was feeling an affinity with in the here and now with the past, and that's quite a powerful mixture of things when you're growing up. Your first thoughts that are endowed with the ideas of being of other cultures, or a culture. They're growing up in a culture where I thought I was actually Zulu. And when we played games, for example, we play games the British versus the Zulu at a St. Lawana, for example, and then we'd all fight to be the Zulu, not the British. But my father had an affinity with the British Empire because his father, my grandfather, fought in the war and was taken prisoner. My great uncle was taken prisoner. So there's a tradition. The Latham's tradition is very tied to the British Empire in many ways. Whereas on my mother's side, it was much more diverse because my great-great-great-grandmother came from Canada and eloped at 16, took a ship in the 1800s to Cape Town and ended up in Beaufort West, which is the middle of the Karoo Desert. So, so those kind of flows of consciousness going through me, with my grandmother telling me stories, and her stories were, my whole family is artistic. I'm a musician. My sons are musicians. My grandmother and my great-grandparents were musicians. They used to run all the shows in the town hall at Beaufort West, and they were famous for doing that. My uncle, my mother's brother, is an opera singer who spent 30 years in Vienna singing with Pavarotti and co. So having the dramatic side of your life plus that kind of cultural thing kind of smashed into me, I guess. And that's it. I mean, that was the emergence of things that led to other things.
Wow, you're very diverse background, ancestry. So what's your instrument?
Guitar, mainly.
Uh-huh.
Lead and rhythm, playing blues and jazz, for example.
Oh, right. So electric.
And like all of us, we self-taught. I can't read music, which drives my kids mad because they are real musicians. I actually paid for my kids' school fees playing music 4 or 5 nights a week with a band, doing hundreds of weddings and you name it. We played it around Southern Africa mainly. And so that also allowed me to experience the performative side, I suppose, of presenting a storyline. We did a lot of Tom Waits songs, which are packed with poetry and drama. And so anyway, that was that period. I stopped in 2019. I actually played the last year with my sons, with a South African songwriter. We were the session musicians for him, with the drummer who was an American in my band for 20 years. And 2019, we played the whole year to launch his album, and then we launched it in January of 2020, which of course was not the best time to launch anything musically. No. We had a whole plan for touring and you name it, and it collapsed. So, and since then, I really haven't performed live at all. So that side of my life is kind of, I suppose, in somewhat of a doldrums. But then again, the podcasting,
I hope you're keeping up the playing, because otherwise, it's a use it or lose it.
It is. No, I play every day. I have been doing that since I was 14 or so. So, it's I get withdrawal symptoms if I don't express some form of art. And I suppose many people will tell you that, and you probably have the similar thing with whatever you do to express yourself artistically. So, but thanks for reminding me to go and practice. I'm going to the beach after this, and then I will practice.
Okay.
Or just play.
I want you to tell the story of how it came that you started the podcast. And the podcast is called South African History. I listen to it almost
History
daily.
of South Africa. HOSA, as it's known in my yard. Yes, History of South Africa. Okay, that's a medium story that starts in it starts back when I was studying, and always interested in history my whole life, mainly because of what I've explained with the cultural mixtures. Going from there into 2017, when I was looking for a podcast on the Anglo-Boer War, which is phenomenally important in world history, and there just wasn't one. So I thought, well, I better do one because of my broadcast background. I'm a professional broadcaster as well. So I thought, let me have a go. And I thought I'd do it for 6 months and blow up. But after a few months, the listenership started rising into the tens of thousands, which I was told at the time was good, because more than 500 is apparently good for audio podcasts. So I actually wasn't really looking at the numbers. And the bottom line is, I said, I want to do this for me. And I know a lot of podcasters and people like, I suppose, John Tertia, you're doing what you're doing mainly for yourselves. You're not really, I wasn't thinking of an audience. I was going, okay, this is how I'd want it to be. So this is how I'm going to do it. And then it led to just a remarkable communication with people from around the world. I mean, I've got listeners to that podcast from Russia and France, and they send me pictures of their relatives' uniforms they've still got in cupboards with bullet holes in them. So, and of course, the British link and the Australian, the Commonwealth generally, all the main countries fought, including India was here. Of course, it was Churchill's baptism.
Yes.
He was a war reporter, and he was actually thrown into prison. He was captured, almost shot dead because he was carrying dum-dum bullets in his hand at the time.
It was his most glorious time.
Is that what he said? Yeah. And then, of course, Gandhi. Gandhi and Churchill met. Well, they didn't really meet. They wrote letters. They never met face to face, but they wrote letters to each other later and realized that they'd passed each other on the hill at Spion-Kop, one of the huge battles. And Gandhi was carrying a stretcher, and Churchill ran past him, and they recalled that moment later. And of course, those two ended up as two of the most powerful and important people of the 20th century. So I thought, well, let me do a podcast on this, because there's a lot of other unknowns here that about technology, about South Africa's role in the Great War, the First World War. Every single one of the major generals and officers who fought on the British side, and some of the Germans, were here in South Africa, either monitoring. The Germans were monitoring what was going on. They were watching the British, sometimes on both sides, from the Boers side, and they would monitor from the British side. And and they had, like, Haig, who ran the British Expeditionary Force in the Western Front. They really learned a lot of the art of what they were doing here and forgot it, apparently, because there was all mobility here, and then they got stuck in the trenches. So that connection, I thought, was important.
Yeah, it was the early day of the machine gun, wasn't it?
Yes, and trenches and barbed wire, and the use of industrial rifles that had that did not use gunpowder. They were smokeless, so it's very hard to see where your enemy was in the mountains. That's why the Boers shot so many British.
Yes.
There's a long list of firsts which you don't necessarily really want to think about much, because it's mainly all about disaster and death. But it also involved quite interesting women spies on the Boer side, because of how the British marched to Pretoria in 1900, early 1901, took Pretoria by April, and then the war really started. And then it took until the end of 1902 before the riddle was solved. It's a 3-year war that was supposed to take a few weeks. Reminds me of Russia and the Ukraine in many ways.
Yes. I was going to say, how often does that happen? You know, this is just going to be over in a week. 4 years later.
So that set off a whole chain of events. And then I launched, I've done 7 podcasts. 2 are live at the moment. One is History of South Africa, and the other one is Plane Crash Diaries. I love aviation. The other one is Plane Crash Diaries, which is about aviation and safety. I'm a pilot. I love aviation. I have every spare cent I can throw into that. I'm only a PPL, a private pilot, but I've been doing it since 2008. And I just really appreciate the sector, the science and aviation sector. So we've got a podcast called Plane Crash Diaries, which is looking at safety, how accidents actually improve safety, ironically.
Yes, indeed.
So that's the 2. The others I've done is podcast on Stalingrad, because when Russia invaded Ukraine, or Crimea first, and took it, I was a journalist working at Business Day and Financial Mail. I was the online editor and then the television editor. And we got the Russian ambassador to come and explain the thinking behind the invasion. And I just got interested in Stalingrad in particular, because he kept referring to it in private conversation with me. I had a 2-hour interview with him in his office. And so I thought, well, I need to kind of understand this, the thinking, the mind of the Russian nationalist, what makes him tick. So I spent, and the techniques I use in this, John and Tish, is that I try and tell the story weekly based on what is happening at that period. So the Stalingrad one, I started in October as the Russians arrived in 1942 at Stalingrad, and they were defeated in February the following year. And that's 7 or 8 months. So I try and tell it over the 7 or 8 month period weekly. The same with the Boer War. I did it weekly.
Yes, so it's sort of chronological in that case, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
Because I'm a simpleton. So if I don't do it like that, thematically, it makes no sense. I'm like,
Yes.
I'll miss the theme. So if I do it chronologically, it
Yes.
kind of also it's story based naturally.
Yes.
And
Yes. This is what
you don't
happened
have to
100
say
years
then,
ago.
yeah. You don't have to say then if but. So you can piece things together without deploying really boring techniques. Saying things like last week, you remember we were talking about this. Well, following from that, this happened, and people kind of I've realized they really like that. And that's how my grandmother, Tertia, used to tell me stories.
Yes. Yes.
Remember last night we'd got to the point where I was in the ox wagon.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Well, this is that, and I was like, okay, tell me now, Granny, please, for goodness sake. I was like, I had a dream about it. I was so interested, and then I went to sleep. Now I'm here again. Tell me. And she puffed
Yes.
away in her menthol cigarettes with her long 1920s style
Yes.
cigarette holder, blowing smoke rings.
Yes.
Did your grandmother know Chris Barnard? Because he hails from Perfect
She
West.
did, and she never stopped telling me that that little town was really important because it gave everyone fantastic teeth because of the water, which is the dentists of Beaufort West say it's a myth, but anyway, people like to believe it. And Beaufort West also gave the world. Chris Barnard did the first heart transplant, so she was very proud of that.
Yes.
Those and a number of other firsts. They had a specialized irrigation system in the town that used to the whole town was irrigated in a system of canals. So they had a small canal so that every house could use tap the water for their fruit and vegetables. So she was very proud of that.
We have those in Worcester. It's a leifhoer in Afrikaans. So it's just like it's about this wide and this deep.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's still in use. Different parts of it's only in the older part of town. And then there's a dam in the middle of the town, and then on certain days, certain parts of the town get the water. So the water runs past, and then you in the past, obviously there you'd have your own canal from the main canal into your backyard. We don't have those anymore. But I want you to tell us about your experiences as a journalist in the late 1980s, early 90s, when South Africa went from nationalist apartheid government to the first democratic elections. I can imagine as a journalist in those days, especially the one that's fluent Zulu, you must have some stories to can you tell us without being without running the risk of being shot?
No. I was the main 702 reporter. There were two reporters in 702's newsroom, and there were only two radio stations that were independent, and one was 702, broadcasting ironically from a homeland called Bophuthatswana. And I was really useful, I suppose, thinking about it then, because I was also military trained. I'd spent 2 years. I was a combat medic. I'd been in Angola, 1981. I was in an operation corporate here. I had a lot of combat experience as an ops medic, and then I was an instructor. And that kind of conscientized me to some extent to realize, because I was sitting on top of a vehicle that had been pulverized in an attack. It was a T-32 tank, a Russian tank, and I heard a report on the radio that I brought along with me that the South Africans were not in Angola, and I thought, well, we definitely are, because I'm sitting on a tank in a place called Zangongo, and it's like a couple of 100 k's into Angola. Here I am sitting on this tank, lots of people dead around me. So I realized, I had to make a decision. And so from then I went to Rhodes University and then ended up working as a war reporter, I guess. Speaking Zulu and isiXhosa, I was the so-called township reporter. So I followed the violence around South Africa as it escalated, unfortunately, in the late 80s. 89 it started really, through to 93 when I actually resigned, because there was I'd been in every single major confrontation clash in the country, plus my military background. I was kind of a bit burnt out, and so I went to my editor and I said, look, there's going to be a march in Bishu. He said, well, you going tomorrow? I said, I just do not want to go. I can feel there's a bullet with my name on it, and it's probably them. So they sent someone called David O'Sullivan, who ended up working from Capital Radio. And the guy lying in the road next to him was shot in the head. And I said to them later that that was me in the road. I feel that I got out just in time. So I ended up at Stanford University in 93, 94. I was given a bursary by Reuters for the night fellowship. as the first South African because of all of this. So that's the long story. I mean, the military helped me to understand what was going on, and it formed. And to this day, I think the fact that I have these medical skills. I've been involved in car crashes, at least half a dozen over the past few years, where I've actually kept someone alive, and I felt that it's payback. You have to atone sometimes for things, and without being self-serving or righteous or anything like that. It's just a deep-seated belief that, so that's why I flung myself into the journalism side as a township reporter. And there are many instances. I mean, in one day, virtually every side tried to kill me. I was first beaten up by the PAC, the Pan Africanist Congress. They were this was in 1991, early 91. They were having a meeting at the Gold Reef City, and being a white reporter, they were picking on white reporters because of Africanism, which is a big political perspective. And Pan-Africanism is that Africans belong in Africa and the Europeans in Europe, and you need to go. That's really the essence of it. So they were slapping around with an American women journalist, and I managed to get out of there when the marshals arrived. Jumped in the car. We had beepers that didn't blow up back in the day, and the beeper went off and said that there was a necklacing. Necklacing was that someone had a tire thrown around their neck and was set fire. It was going on in Tukoza Township. So I drove there with South African Press Association car, and I had these big decals on the side of the car saying 702 News. Straight into this guy was dead, burning, and the Zulu impi that had killed him was standing around him, and we drove straight into them around a corner, and they attacked the car. And me having Zulu capacity, I was shouting at them. And in fact, I have an accent. I have an accent from Inkwaleni. It's a very strange Zulu accent. It's localized. And one guy had a gun to the head of the American journalist with me, and someone pushed him away, and we just managed to get out of there. And then a bleeper went off again. This is all in one day. The bleeper went off again and said Mamelodi, that the police are shooting at people in Mamelodi. So then I rushed off to Mamelodi Township, and the police were driving around shooting tear gas canisters at people. And the one shot a canister from about 20 meters away straight at me and just missed my head. And if that had hit me in the head, it would kill me. And so that was when I drove back to the 702's newsroom. I thought to myself, you must be doing something right, because everyone is trying to kill you. All the sides don't like you. First of all, it was the Africanists, and then the MP, and then the police. So over the years when I've trained,
you obviously weren't showing any bias.
Well, that's what I said to journalists who are social justice journalists at the moment. I said you must beware of carrying your flag. I know we understand human rights and advocacy, and I teach advocacy-based journalists all the time about personal security. Anyway, so that was one of the days that rounded off. That kind of forms, I think, an example of what you're asking, Tertia.
That's enough. That's enough incidents in one day to last, I don't know, a year in any normal life, I should think. How come you seem to be such a normal person now? Do you have PTSD or anything? I mean, do you sleep?
I had PTSD, but again, I'm one of those people that faces these things, and I also don't dwell. So I use music as myself. I don't have religion, I have music, and it's a church for people, and any art form that is depth is a church of the soul. I think firstly. Secondly, I had an amazing mother and father, both of them. My parents brought me up not to see bias. My mother is like an angel, and so she's kind of imbued a lot of strengths. My father is really, really tough. He's a farmer from KZN. Pretty old school. My mother and father believed in black rights. They believed in women should be paid the same. And there we were living on a farm in the 60s where I grew up with that kind of concept, surrounded by really pro-apartheid lunatics, white farmers, a lot of them, who believed that black people were not even human and were violent and so on. So I think, John, it's a combination of these factors. The realization, when you have a realization that's underpins things, you can't bribe me, for example. I'm unbribable. I've seen children dying in the streets for South Africa's vote. So people who are corrupt, for me, have like a target on their backs because they're selling the souls of those kids. I watched 13-year-olds dying in Soweto, literally being shot struggling for the right to vote.
Yeah.
When you see that kind of thing, your little problems diminish somewhat.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So that's also having a perspective on my little role in life has helped a lot, John, by retaining that constant understanding.
I want to redirect the conversation to what we mentioned earlier before you joined us, John, about there's this opinion that the quality, that's not what the word you use, but the information that we're getting today and how we get it is problematic. And I want to link that to the fact that you also have you've studied in history. It's your area of specialization, and I find that most people don't appreciate the value of history as a subject. And what you said now resonates very strongly with me, because if one has only a very if one has no feeling for history, and I want to use the word feeling because it's not about knowing facts, it's about seeing the picture. If you don't see your place in history, then you overestimate your own importance.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you speak to that for a bit, Des? And I think that's a major problem in our society, that most people don't see the big picture of history. Just human history of since 3000 BCE. I mean, we don't even have to go to prehistory, just from the time of writing, roundabout, to where we are now. How, if more people knew more about history, even their local, only their country history, they would have a much different view on the world and how to act in the world. What do you say to that?
Yes, it's deformed by a prism of the present. So the retailers of the past deform it by the perceptions about what they want from the present. So that is the main problem, and has been forever in the telling of history in across the world, is that your present circumstance deforms your perception of what happened in the past. And that's the first thing. The second thing, I was fortunate enough to be lectured by someone called John Stilgo at Harvard University for a year in the School of Landscape and Design. He's an amazing and an influential person there. And he changed my thinking about some of these things that led to the podcast, by saying that it's not what you see, it's what you don't see. That is so powerful and evocative. And you don't see it because you are only seeing the surface layer of what the reality is. So with the podcasting, what I try and do is I use a lot of oral history. And I don't say this is what happened. I say this is what these people say happened all the time. Because if you do in any other way, it's just fallacy. Then you have a theory and a hypothesis, and a hypothesis in history is dangerous because the reality is too weird. Mkabayi was Shaka's aunt, a woman in the Zulu society. But in Zulu society, women are powerful. It's matrilineal because men kill each other, like the Vikings. It's matrilineal. So the concept of women having no power in a traditional society is just an insult to those women. So in Kabai, for example, she ordered Shaka's killing. Dingaan killed Shaka on her orders. And then when the councillors met after the killing to decide who should be the next king, and we're going to not vote for Dingaan because a person who killed the previous king can't be the next king. It's the rule of ritual in many societies, not just the Amazulu. She dressed as a man. She's 6 foot plus and very strong, apparently, rocks into the meeting where all these men are sitting discussing the future and tells them what they're going to decide. And they do, lo and behold, decide. Now, that's not a known story, but that's a fact. The oral tradition in Zulu, there are 3 versions of that story. Okay, if you go look for it, so it's not some white guy like me talking about it, or some English person writing in a book. In oral tradition, in Zulu oral tradition, there are 3 stories about that moment. They differ on certain aspects, but they all agree about that. So that by itself is a historical fact that deserves the information flowing through our airwaves because of the power of the contemporary voice about feminism and gender. The idea that people in the past were not as clever as us, was some amazing thing that the people think
that's just
lunacy.
That's hubris and egocentrism,
isn't it just? So that's the main reason that I've enjoyed doing this, because every time I look at a subject, and every year I'm doing it yearly, and and I try and move quickly year by year, I find some fascinating information that really explains a lot of what was going on in the world, not just here, of course, because South Africa is so important in terms of the British Empire for many reasons. Long before gold and diamonds were discovered, as a port of call to India, and other reasons in the wars against France, South Africa was really important as a port. The Cape in particular, Cape Town, and so on. So, and the British Empire being so resoundingly important to world history over hundreds of years. If you look at the stories and understand them and try and present them in a broad way to people, that's, I found it's resonated. And here it is. Here I am, some content award. I'm up for another award as well with Times Live history show. That's also, it's the South African Podcasters Guild. And I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm boasting, but I keep thinking to myself, what the, excuse my language, hell am I doing? I'm just having fun with information, trying to tell the truth because of how lies have battered our lives. And it goes back to the story of me sitting on a T32 out in Zangongo and hearing I'm actually not there, and having that really that obsession with getting to the real story. That's really at the heart of all of this.
Did the Zulus have writing?
No, none of the Nguni had any writing.
Well, this is interesting, you see, because I'm not a historian, but I had friends who were historians, and for them, for mainstream history, you need multiple independent corroborating written or otherwise actual physically recorded sources. But of course, that can't apply to a community that doesn't have writing.
Yes. And I mean, there's a fundamental question about what Socrates used to say, about the perception that a memory that is recalled through the faculty of the strength of your mind to recall it is more powerful than a memory that is recalled because it is written. Broken telephones is a problem with oral history. So I was giving an example of Nkabai, Shaka's aunt, his mother Nandi's sister, for a reason, because the stories compress. However, the other thing is true.
Before you go on, are those mythological characters?
No, those are real.
Right. So that's the problem, isn't it? How do you tell if it's only oral?
Well,
because I'll tell you, because there's cross-referencing. So I don't just go in oral history. I cross-reference against reports. And it's not always in the reports you'd imagine where someone is talking about their history. But there's a number of missionaries were around at the time, and we're also hearing similar reports and wrote them down, for example. So so you cross-reference something that is free-form, exposed through the oral tradition with something that's written down. However, I want to just remind everyone that no one lies more than people who write things down. And the problem with this perception is that most of how we exist in life is in contract terms is predated by some kind of form of agreement, which must be understood. So language is a major problem there too. In South Africa here, Shell has been trying to explore along the Wild Coast here, which is a pristine area of South Africa's southeast coastline on the Indian Ocean. And the traditional Xhosa people were negotiating with Shell until eventually they realized that the translators were not translating the story properly. And so now they will only negotiate in Xhosa. There's no English because of how translators and also the company, Shell, was accused and found liable in this case, by the way, of using creative editing. Saying, yeah, but you guys signed this. So, we could have a long debate about this, and I've done a lot of research into this. But I've also honored the idea that the stories are important because, when Churchill and Gandhi wrote to each other, they didn't have a diary to call on. They had their memories, and they said to each other that I remember walking past this guy. And they both realized in an exchange of letters in the 40s
that was me.
That they'd passed each other at that moment. And that was 40 years later that they could do that. So someone begat someone, you can kind of track that. And then the problem starts with timing.
Yes.
So we know that that Ishori, by the way, is quite a powerful character in the Xhosa tradition. He's the man who started the lineages going back hundreds of years. We think to late 1600s, early 1700s. He begat, and we as historians have tried to piece together when it all happened. And then luckily for us, we have another tool called archaeology. And this has helped a huge amount because you can't really get archaeology on Kabai specifically, but the roles and the aspects of what was spoken about there was Shaka had moved his great place from where I grew up in Kwaleni on the mountain there to Kwadakuza, Stanger near Durban for a number of reasons. And then that's where his mother died. And that's where his auntie blamed him for moving his mother, to this godforsaken, infested place. It wasn't that bad, but probably she was ill with something. And that's all of these are facts that happened. The timing of it is another story. And of course, growing up in the tradition of having chronology embedded in your thinking, that does ask many questions. But many people are fundamentalists on this, and you need not to be. They say, because you don't have it written, I don't believe it. And other side, people say, because you wrote it, it was wrong because you wrote an incorrect version. I don't believe it. So you have this fundamentalist split. So I'm trying to combine both elements. There was a document when Potgieter was killed by Dingaan. There was a document that was found on his body later, and it's so in a satchel, and it proved that
you don't mean
Dingaan. Retief, sorry.
You said
that Retief. Yeah, I mean Retief. Peter Retief. So apologies. That Retief had somehow got Dingaan to sign, and there it was. And for many years, historians for decades said, that's just wrong. It was created by the Boers to show that Dingaan gave them the northern Natal region, blah, blah, blah. Now we know he did actually do that. But he was like doing it with his tongue in his cheek because he was going to kill them. So like, you want me to make you happy for a minute? I'm going to sign here and I'll sign there. And out you go, and we're going to like bash your head and throw you off a cliff. So we know that that's what happened. That's even the missionaries, Owen, who was around at the time, said that. But if you believe that he did sign that, and therefore the land belongs to the Boers, versus the Zulu saying, well, he may have signed it, but he didn't believe what he was signing. What do you do about that?
Yes.
So I realized that part of the story is understanding what the hell these people are doing in real time. Excuse my language again. That you've got to actually get the prism of the moment out and look at the incidents and the events, and you'll be shattered by the reality is an echo. It's not a repeat of history. It's an echo. Vico, I think, used to talk about cycles of history in a spiral. Like it repeats itself, but always in another aegis or dimension or something. So it's similar with this kind of logic approaching this kind of story, is to say, look, after doing an intense investigation, me and dozens of other historians, it now looks like there actually was a signing of some sort. But it also was very clear, because Dingaan had decided to kill Retief long before he killed him, that at some point, and then Retief was upset having to leave all his firearms outside because Dingaan managed to convince them. And to placate them even further, he said, sure, we'll give you what you want, land and so on. Meanwhile, he'd spent the last months talking to his counselors, and we have huge amounts of information about this, including from written information, saying the opposite, saying all the Boers want is my land. We got to get rid of them. But I don't want to do that because then, I'm going to kill these Boers, and then more of them are going to pitch up. How do we do it? And the counselors, many of the counselors around him were saying, including in Kabai, by the way, was saying to him, she was still alive, his auntie, was saying to him, do it. They're getting closer. You know how powerful they are. They've defeated Mzilikazi as well by now. They've driven Mzilikazi away from the Transvaal. He was already in Zimbabwe, or making his way there via Botswana. So, and they couldn't defeat the Mzilikazi. Shaka tried repeatedly to defeat Mzilikazi, who came from very close to where you grew up, Tisha, near he came from Vryheid area actually, and ended up where Pretoria is now, and then he was chased away from there by the Zulu impies, and he ended up in Mariko, and then the Boers crossed this Vaal, and he regarded the Vaal as his marches, empty land. So he attacked the Boers, and then the Boers defeated him, and he ran away to Zimbabwe, and that's the Ndebele people of Zimbabwe. That's their story. So, which is pretty recent if you go in human existence. That's in the 1830s. So all you do, so these stories are just break temporary knowledge about what is suspected about what black people are supposed to do and what white people are supposed to do. It's there's shades of brown and pink, and just when you think that it's an easy answer to a difficult problem, you have this conundrum that presents itself based on the facts of the time, and people don't want to see some of those facts, John and Tricia. They don't want to see them.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, thank you. This is the problem, isn't it? People want to hark back and maintain a grievance which really belonged 2 generations ago. And they're not prepared. I want a reset button. I want to press reset and point out to people that history is not passed on in eggs and sperms. Let's start again. Let's pretend none of that happened. Let's look forward and say, we're here. This is where we are. Let's try and get on together from the future, in the future.
Well, we don't need a reset. We can't get the reset. What I think we need is just an understanding that each generation is the product of where they are in that moment in time, and that the stories we hear and the stories we tell are stories that are based in fact to a greater or lesser extent, but we don't have to stick to the black and white stories. We can learn to appreciate the nuance, and we can understand that hindsight is 20/20 vision, and we can't live in the moment as if we are as if we're only the products of our past. I'm thinking of colonialism, for example, and in South Africa currently there's a big thing about how the white people need to stand up for Afrikaans and Afrikaner, and that's all of that goes back to the stories about the Great Trek. And if you think about what's happening in the United States at the moment, where it's about Trump is telling a story based on certain things, and we've lost the experience of history as a story with nuance and with characters who happen to be real people, but who are as flawed and as broken as any normal person in the world that we live in at the moment. But we struggle to get our heads around that because we want that reset button, and even that won't help, because the moment you go on to the next day, you can't reset every day. We have to realize that it's way more complicated, and we have to we have to revel in the stories and pick from the stories our own story as we go along. That's what I'd like to see happening.
Yeah, I think it's insulting behavior to say that people, black South Africans, just were defeated as if it's, it was obvious the industrial complex of Europe took them over. That information, if anyone believes that, is totally incorrect. The competition and the power of Nguni and African forces fighting for themselves and also each other is deeply rooted in here. African culture is rooted in ironworking. People kind of equate this at the period to like the experience of the Americans. The Americans met people who were from the Stone and Bone Age. The Dutch and the English met people here who were from the Iron Age. When the English went to Australia, they met people from the Stone and Bone Age. In South Africa, they met people from the Iron Age. South Africans were building towns of 10,000 long before the Dutch rocked up here. So,
and did they have extraction of iron and
Yes, they mined iron and sold iron actually and gold along the coast for well over 1,000 years to Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders. The movement of goods around Southern Africa is one of the hidden gems of my being able to tell a story, because it goes back to about 1,400 years at least, and there are trails in archaeology that prove that. So telling this story has been very interesting. When the first Dutch arrived at Dittakong, which is near Kimberley is now, in South Africa. It's in the Upper Karoo, Namaqualand.
Mm.
They found a town of 10,000 people there, which had basic ablution facilities, and it was very clean, and it had a massive herd around it. But 10,000 people is a large town back in
Yeah. Yes.
the late 1700s.
Yes.
Anyway, so this I always remind people. I say, look, the Zulus and the Xhosa didn't have running toilets. They used to defecate in the veld, so it wasn't like a fun place to be. Every few years, they had to move the great places because it was just a mess. So and so if you have this thing about it, everyone was living in this wonderful tropical environment and it was lovely. It wasn't. There were issues, but the health was actually better than most of the missionaries who arrived. They had a much healthier lifestyle because they were eating food and being outdoors and were dying of illnesses. But there's again a myth about that illness. They were fighting their own fights internally. They were much more complex. They understood what was going on in the world. This thing about, a big person from Europe with your big ship, you must be powerful. It's just, baloney. The way in which the Xhosa used the Dutch and the British against each other for, centuries was clever. The way Moshweshwe did the same thing was clever. It was understanding diplomacy and also understanding, you're saying, Tertia, about the flow of consciousness, the minute, the moment, understanding where they were and not responding in a trite way, but stepping back. All of the Zulu chiefs, the main Zulu chiefs of South Africa, used the missionaries as diplomats when they realized that these guys weren't the same as the other white people. They were, but they weren't. They would get them in and then get them to write letters because they recognized the compassion side, the empathy was at a different level. So that led directly to the ANC, for example, that relationship. Fort Hare, Mandela, those things. That goes back hundreds of years as a experience of South Africans in South Africa. The African units would use the first Boers and British who rocked up in the environment as tools. They didn't see them as the sharp edge of colonialism at all. That's a revisionist mistake. They saw them as tools to use. They thought, for instance, when the first Boers arrived with the Xhosa in the late 1700s, the Boers lived with the Xhosa and married Xhosa women. That's not a story that in apartheid like to be told.
No.
The nationalists forgot that. And I've got the names, I've got the ranks, and I've got the numbers. All right. We all know this happened. The Xhosa recognized that these people had some technology that they could use, and the Boers recognized, or the first Dutch pre-Boer, who recognized that the Xhosa had a tie on their land and they needed the chief's daughter's hand in marriage to form a political unit, and so that they could survive. They were happily marrying into Black and Khoi culture, happily. So the message now is, oh no, they arrived and separated themselves. The separation happened during the foot trekkers, when the trekkers expanded. The separation, and with the British who built towns, and they weren't part of the whole trekker philosophy. The livestock movement, the use of land was in a different way. It was industrialization. It was linked to the whole expanding industrial complex in England, and so on. So the Boers then formed the crux of the apartheid thinking. It firmed up as the trekkers moved into the interior. Then they became this bubble of white, if you like, or European, Christian versus heathen, and so on. So when you tell those early stories, it blows people's minds.
Yeah. So it's blowing mine right now. So I wanted to know, archaeologically speaking, are there iron artifacts then going back hundreds of years?
Thousands of years in South Africa. Oh yes,
that is amazing. I haven't been exposed to that piece of information before.
And some cultures could not work the iron but would trade it. So a good example of that is the Tswana people could work the iron. So in the area where all the big South Africa's iron mines are now, in Sishen area of the Northern Cape, the Tswana people who lived there, and the pre-Tswana, knew how to mine iron from the rock, smelt it down, and convert it into tools.
Well, you need 800 degrees to do that, so that's quite.
They could do that. Yes, and but the Khoi couldn't. The Khoi were transhuman travelers who were related to the San. They couldn't do that, but they used to trade things for it. So the Khoi loved metals, but couldn't make it themselves. But the Tswana could. So there's a band of people going back to, say, 200, 300 AD, who were experts at working metals in South Africa. And they would trade these metals and their power, if you like, from that, and created some of these larger states that we know about in the 1100. Manu-Motapa Empire, for example, in 1100 to 1300, were big metal creators and traders. Not just that, but they were very good at trading, at bartering goods like ivory and gold, and even slaves in the north of Zimbabwe into Mozambique, for goods that they like Chinese and Middle Eastern pottery, which you can find in turn in the oddest places like northern Botswana, which go back 1400 years. You say, where did this come from? That's the story it was traded. So yeah, it's a bit of a myth. So that's one of the problems with the association of, all first peoples, because the Tswana and the Nguni weren't the first peoples. They were the second peoples. The first peoples were the Khoi and the San. The San go back 70,000 years plus in South Africa. The Khoi go back to 2,000 and 2,300 years back, 300 BC before, 2,300 before present. And there's a tension that's grown in South Africa post-apartheid about the relationship between the first peoples and black South Africans, because the first peoples were not black, and they were not even seen as that by Tswana and Xhosa. They've just been lumped together in the post-colonial struggle philosophy of people who want to write history books. All the whites were there, and the rest of the people were there. It's a insult to the memory of those people who created a complex environment and societies, thousands of years old in South Africa. They created towns competing with each other. You know what I mean? It's an insult to them, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, the history is written by the victor, of course, and he wants to write something simple that the readers will understand, and so it is a black and white account. So, but Tosi has written some stuff about you. Oh no, this is not about you. This is about Mickey. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's your next guest, isn't it?
So I need to leave now. As that's the way of saying we've had enough of you. Out, out.
Well, John is very strict on the. John is very strict, but I want to ask you, not my regular question, John. My regular question, Des, I always try to ask. I want to sneak this question in it always, because it's my pet philosophical project at the moment. Is, do you think we have free will? But that's not the question I will ask you now.
No, I'll answer that. You want.
But not now, because there's 3 minutes left. What's your next project that you're going to work on? What's your next podcast topic? You've done Stolen Grant. You've done a podcast about the border war, the South African border war. Am I right? And
another big one. SA Border Wars. That's another big one, which I'm going to do more work on now. I did one of the Falklands. I was in the army at the same time as the Falklands, and we were ironic because we supported both sides. We had R1s, which were the version of the FN that the British were using, and the Argentinians. We flew around in the same aircraft as the British and the Argentinians. The Argentinians were, as a dictatorship, were friends with the apartheid government, but the British were friends with the apartheid government too, under Thatcher. So we were sitting in our bunks, our barracks, arguing, debating how we supported both sides. So I thought, well, let me tell the story from both sides, which is what I did, and I've had a huge response from Argentinians and English listeners saying.
So what is an episode?
It's called Battle of the Falklands, or the Falklands War. The Falklands War, that is. Then I did. So I'm at the point now where I'm deciding to write 2 books. I've been approached by a publisher and I've signed a contract. One on history of South Africa, and then another is there's a bit of a fight going on about plane crashes. It's a long story. I won't bore you, but possibly on that. Then the Zimbabwean war. A lot of the ex-combatants, including people from Zipra and ZANU, have actually contacted me. One guy in particular, he actually sent me a note in the last week saying, come on. I know you're not going to do it from the white perspective or the Rhodesian army perspective. We need someone like you to tell the story. He's been pushing me, sending me source material from the Zipra and the armed forces, the struggle forces. So I'm now thinking, God, should I dive into that pool? So that's possibly the next one, is the Bush War and Rhodesian Bush War stroke the Zimbabwean struggle for independence. I may have a go.
Wow. Yeah.
And Des hasn't even started to tell us about his other adventures in journalism. We've heard the very violent parts, but I'm sure you have many other stories to tell. with an hour of your time being taken. The ocean is calling. Des lives not far from us, from where I am, John, on the coast.
Yeah.
Pearly Beach is the area. Just Blombos can't be that far away from. Blombos is further
Yeah,
east.
yeah, we're not near Blombos.
Okay, and the reason I'm saying Blombos is because the Blombos Caves is on the southeast coast, and that is where they've discovered one of the first examples in the world of early humans practicing art.
That is actually that's a 20-minute drive from here. So when I say close, it's the other side of Gansbaai near the Kelders.
Yeah,
it's 70,000 to 80,000 years old, and I was talking to my son actually. We're going to take a drive there in the next week or so, and I'm going to take my camera.
Have you been there before? Have you been there before?
Never. I'm very excited to visit.
How accessible is it? Because it's an archaeological site. It must be protected. I hope it's protected.
Well, for two reasons, inaccessible. It's down the side of a really, really steep cliff, and it's in a junction. It's a cave setup. But it is protected, so I can't go in.
Yeah.
But I'm happy to sit outside and click my camera away, because it's always the environment.
Share your photos. I'll pass them on to John, and we can post them. But yeah, Des, it was as interesting as I knew it was going to be. Thank you so much for your time. And
kind of you to speak to me.
No, it was great fun, and I hope
Absolutely.
some of our English listeners will give your podcast a listen, because there are strong links between South Africa and the British Empire and the UK, and I think those links need more exploration than we've done so far in the past 100 or so years. I think the connections need to be digested on a continual basis. And thank you so much. Thank you, John, for being present at your own channel's recording.
Yes, I won't bore you with why I was late. It's such a puzzle. Anyway, it's been fantastic, Des. Thank you very much.
John and Tisha, I'm honored. Thank you.
Thank you, Des. Bye.
Bye-bye.